All right, let's dive right into this explainer by looking at a pretty universal quirk we all seem to share, and that is avoiding simply asking for what we actually want. I mean, if you've ever found yourself hoping someone would just magically read your mind, or if you've been on the receiving end of a very heavy, very loaded silence, well, you're going to find today's breakdown absolutely fascinating. We're unpacking a comprehensive guide to the subtle and sometimes honestly not so subtle language of indirect requests.
It really forces us to confront a fundamental question, right? Why is it so incredibly hard to just ask? Because instead of being direct, we constantly resort to this complex web of emotions, subtle behaviors, and indirect communication to get our way. We literally replace the simple act of stating a need with an entire theatrical production of hints and gestures. But you might be wondering, just how common is this really?
Well, what's truly staggering here is the sheer volume. Our source material identifies exactly 101 different indirect strategies people use to avoid making a direct request. 101. That is 101 different ways to say what we want without actually saying it. It's kind of wild, and it really highlights just how much energy we burn trying to avoid directness.
Section 1, Emotional and Passive Tactics. Okay, we're going to focus first on how we use passivity and emotion instead of our actual words. Starting right out of the gate with strategy number 1, simply waiting silently. You know the drill, just existing in a space, completely quiet, fiercely hoping the other person miraculously notices what you need without you uttering a single syllable.
And if silence fails, we escalate to number 4, the classic audible sigh or huff. You aren't saying what's wrong, but you are making absolutely sure they hear that something is wrong.
Now, if the size still doesn't work, we hit strategy 14, sulking. This is where we withdraw emotionally, pull back, and just let that heavy negative space do all the talking for us. It's totally a way of forcing the other person to bridge the gap and ask you what's wrong. Which leads us perfectly into these absolute passive-aggressive highlights from the source. Look at how relatable these are. We mention what others received just to highlight what we didn't get. We give exaggerated praise to someone else's experience to drop a really heavy hint about our own desires. We throw out sarcastic remarks, and perhaps the most notorious of the whole bunch, number 35 on the list, saying it's okay when it absolutely definitively isn't. We pretend things are fine and place the entire burden on the listener to decode the opposite meaning. Section 2, Strategic and Subtle Clues. Now, the behaviors start shifting away from purely emotional plays to these covert, subtle operations. It's brilliant in a way, illustrating how people become subtle strategists, laying specific traps. For example, there's what we might call the trail of breadcrumbs. That's strategy 31 and 32, where people leave physical clues around or suddenly start sending you related articles and videos. Then there's the interrogation, where you use leading or hypothetical questions to box someone into an answer. And the setup, strategy 23, offering something first, acting overly helpful, but entirely with the hidden expectation of reciprocity. These specific tactics are really all about testing the waters. We test reactions, we test boundaries, we ask rhetorical questions to gauge exactly where the other person stands. We even try to manufacture pressure by creating a false sense of urgency or scarcity. And we do all of this heavy lifting, all of this psychological maneuvering, without ever actually making a formal request. Which brings us to number 99 on the list. This is an incredibly common and highly effective tactic. You simply present a problem. Maybe you complain about your circumstances or act super confused, and then you wait. You just linger around the subject without actually asking for help, totally waiting for the other person to volunteer, to jump in as the hero, and offer the exact solution you wanted all along.
And finally, item 101, the grand finale of the list, saying never mind. It is the ultimate indirect move. You say never mind while desperately, quietly hoping the other person is going to insist on helping or figuring out what you meant. It's literally a test wrapped in a dismissal.
Section 3, Manipulation or just vulnerability.
So going through this exhausting list of hints, sighs, and strategic traps, it's super easy to feel frustrated. I mean, it forces us to ask, when someone uses these tactics, are they manipulating you? Is a loud sigh or a strategically placed brochure a malicious attempt to control you? Well, the answer is actually quite profound. The crucial takeaway here is that these 101 behaviors usually stem from a fear of being vulnerable. It's the deep discomfort of emotional exposure that prevents someone from making a direct request. Think about it. When you ask directly, you risk rejection. You risk hearing no.
By hinting, sulking, or testing the waters, a person is really just trying to protect themselves from that vulnerability. It rarely comes from a malicious desire to manipulate. It almost always comes from a place of self-protection.
To really drive this home, I want to read this exact quote from the source material. They don't necessarily indicate manipulation. Many people use them because they're uncomfortable being vulnerable or making direct requests. Understanding this builds a tremendous amount of empathy. It changes how we view ourselves when we catch ourselves sighing heavily, and it totally changes how we respond to the indirect communicators in our own lives. They aren't evil masterminds, they're just uncomfortable.
Section 4. The power of directness.
But look, just because it's understandable doesn't mean it's actually effective. So how do we move past these traps? When we contrast the exhausting reality of those 101 indirect methods, all the hinting, the sulking, the testing that just breeds confusion and resentment, against the healthiest approach recommended by the text, the winner is obvious. Clear, respectful communication, simply and directly asking for what you want. Yes, it requires dropping the armor and embracing vulnerability, but it is infinitely more effective than waiting silently and hoping for the best.
This leaves us with a really clear path forward, challenging us to step out of the comfort zone of dropping hints. Take a look at your own communication habits. Ditch the breadcrumbs. Embrace the vulnerability. What will you ask for today, directly?